John Whitehead is president of the Rutherford Institute. It's a national civil liberties organization based here in Charlottesville. Nadine Strossen is the former head of the National ACLU, and John and Nadine have been friends and colleagues for almost, 30 years? Yeah, it's been quite a while. So I'm not going to give you all of their backgrounds. One of the reasons we wanted to go ahead and host this First Amendment Roundtable is because, one, it was an opportunity to be able to have John and Nadine in a casual setting to just talk a little bit more low-key with local journalists about some of the things you guys have dealt with in the past year, some of the things that are coming up in the year to come, some of the things that are happening today. Just this morning, in fact, the Rutherford Institute, working with James West and Josh Wheeler as participating attorneys, was in court on the Kessler perjury trial. Kessler's attorney was attempting to subpoena one of the Seaville Weekly journalists, and Rutherford and James argued basically in terms of First Amendment privilege.
And won.
Won. So anyhow, some interesting things to just kind of discuss, but I'm going to turn this over to you guys and to John and Nadine, and you guys can just basically have at it.
Yeah, I want to say something before my wife Misha here is a great organizer, as you know.
Yes.
And has set up all this stuff, so she deserves the applause. Before you leave, Nadine's got some materials you should pick up, and we have a First Amendment card here you should read. It has all the information that we want to talk about. And these are Bill of Rights billfold cards. You can stick them in your billfold. If you're pulled over by the police, you can read the Fourth Amendment. They may listen. But anyway, so I guess you're going to...
Yeah, I mean, do you guys want to start off with any questions, or maybe you guys have
would
some
you like to do some opening statement?
Yeah, not an opening statement, because I really do believe in free speech, which means your free speech, but so you know how best to use it. John and Nisha were nice enough to set up today's event and tomorrow, because I was here for another reason. I was invited, exercising free speech and modeling civil discourse. I accepted an invitation from a couple of pro-life organizations at the University of Virginia Law School to do a debate. And I really appreciate that, because there are so many organizations now that would never give a platform to somebody whose views they strongly disagree with, so they did that for me. But conversely, there are so many pro-choice advocates who would not deign to accept an invitation from a pro-life organization. So I explained to them that this was an exercise in free speech, as well as debates about reproductive freedom and so forth. But I just want to tell you that this book that I've been working on for the past year is going to be released on April 2nd, and it really summarizes what my point of view is on so many of the issues that have been whirling around, not only in Charlottesville, but I will. It's hate, why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. And it very much advocates counter speech and other steps to resist hatred and discrimination and violence, and argues not only in terms of free speech principles, but as we lawyers would say, makes an independently sufficient argument that even putting those principles aside, which we would never want to do, but assuming hypothetically, that just purely from a strategic and policy point of view, it is so much more effective to use non-censorship strategies, and that censorship in fact is often counterproductive.
I agree 100%. I went to law school after the 60s. I was a 60s activist, and I had a professor named Mort Gittleman, who was the national board of the ACLU at the time. And I became his assistant during law school because we agreed. And he was very, very purist free speech. He believed in everything, hate speech and all that. I'll never forget, though, I'd meet in his office, and on the back of his door, before you'd walk out, when you close it, was the word, a big poster said F-U, F-U-C-K-U. And about the third time I started to walk the door, I turned and looked at him once and said, Professor Gilman, can you tell me why you have fuel in your back door? He goes, John, you've been in my course for how long now? I said, 7 or 8 months. Don't you get it? Free speech? I went, oh, I get it. So at the door, I almost want to turn and say, I didn't. He had a good sense of humor. And I later hooked up with a number of people. I became friends with a guy named Pete Seeger, who was a big social folk singer, and became a friend of mine. And Probably the biggest influence in my life was Nat Henhoff.
Yeah, friend of mine too.
Yeah, my close friend, Nat and I got along really well. I saw him a few days before he passed away, and I spoke at his memorial last year in New York. But he was so incensed about hate speech. He said, "What is this hate speech? You call me on the phone. We got to fight this stuff." That was back early 2000s. So, and I wasn't all in tune with it yet. And I remember Nat. Where's Nisha? Daily. We get phone calls once a day, 2 times a day. And, you know, he was pumping me on hate speech. The more I looked at it, I said, "You're right, Matt. We got to fight this stuff because if we get in the trap, in my opinion, of labeling certain speech hate speech, as I show in my book, Battlefield America, which I have in here, War on the American People, as I studied history, I saw that former regimes had a real neat knack of labeling certain speech, hate speech, antisocial speech, whatever. The Nazis were very good at it, so that you got targeted and arrested. Not by the police so much as, there's a really good book by a fellow named Robert Gellately. The Oxford University Press published a book, professor. He went to Germany and studied all the historical records. And he was shocked when he came to the conclusion that there really weren't not a lot of SWAT team raids in Germany or whatever. Most of the people that got arrested in Germany were by neighbors who called the police, reported them for certain words they said, listening to BBC radio. The police would just knock on the door and say, "You've been reported," and away they would go. Where'd they end up? Concentration camps and stuff like that. So that became sort of their social badge, that they could label you a hate speech person. And what was a hate speech person? I think Hitler's a Nazi, or whatever. That's all it took. And you get in a concentration camp. So what I argue in this book, and I do a lot of historical stuff, is, hey, let's not go down that road. Nadine's right. How you counter so-called speech you don't agree with, whether it's hate speech or whatever, is by countering with more speech and by dialogue and debate. The one thing that I've seen in this country is we've forgotten how to disagree. I mean, you have a recent poll that shows it's out of the Brookings Institution, if you haven't seen it, but a poll of college students across the country, 44% of college students believe that hate speech is not protected under the First Amendment. 51% believe that you can actually shout down speakers. They agree with that. 20% say you can use violence. They check it on the list to stop people from speaking. Go back and look at former regimes. It all flashes back, and I'm going, ooh, where are we headed? When you got the kids coming out of college, and the last thing maybe I'll say that I'm seeing, I have a summer intern program. I had 21 students in my summer intern program from the best schools in the country, Eastern schools, whatever, Yale, whatever. And the funny thing that I noticed is when I would ask them on my initial interview, could you give me the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment? They look at you blankly. These are people that are in law school.
I just have to say, in defense of today's students, sadly, and I say that not just because I educate them or try to, but sadly, those statistics have been replicated for adults and for decades. It's always been true. I remember 1991, which was of course the 200th anniversary of the Bill of Rights, including First Amendment. The American Bar Association did a survey, and more than 50% of adults did not know what the Bill of Rights is. Yeah. And then when they were told what it is, almost 50% said, "Let's get rid of that."
Yeah, it's dangerous.
So I know it is a serious problem, but I think it's different, but it's not worse than it's been in the past. But
the thing I'm concerned about, though, is the young kids coming out, the civics education, what I'm seeing is they have no idea what's in. And here's the thing, here's these Bill of Rights cards. The 10 Amendments is only 462 words. It takes you what, if you're a slow reader, 2 minutes to read them. I'm telling people, just read them over. Read them over. We had a client, by the way, this gives you an example. He was on the street corner, 2 policemen pulled up. He was standing there with a sign saying something. It wasn't inflammatory or whatever. And one of the policemen walked up and said, what right do you have to be out here, or something like that. And he had this card here. He said, here's why right. He read the First Amendment to the policeman, the cop. The cop went, whoa. He handed up the card, and the car got in the car and said, okay, sir, just hamper it down, and they drove off. So I'm saying civics education can't, even on the street corner.
So do we have any questions? Because obviously John and I could talk for 3 hours each at least. But we'd love to entertain questions or comments from anybody here.
All right, I got a question. So suppose we modify our understanding of the weaponry that people are allowed to have, and thereby we reject the Second Amendment or reject the very expansive view of it that the NRA has championed. Do we run the risk of harming the other 9?
I think so. Do you mind giving me?
Sure, my name's Hawes Spencer.
Hi,
I'm
Hawes.
freelance.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
I'll go first. And
Sure.
and I have no idea what John's views are on this topic. First of all, I don't think it is necessary to amend the Second Amendment or repeal it because it is not clear at all that the kind of brandishing of weaponry in public places, especially in the context of a contentious demonstration with counter-protests, that is constitutionally protected. In the historic decision in which the Supreme Court, in Justice Scalia's opinion, by a 5-4 vote, I hasten to add, for the very first time held that the Second Amendment does protect some private right to bear arms outside the context of a well-regulated militia. That opinion was so narrowly circumscribed, right? You could disagree with that holding, but it was a very narrow holding. He stressed repeatedly, we are only deciding the particular issue in this case, that is the constitutionality of the DC statute that absolutely prohibits any gun possession in the home, and therefore he confined his holding to homeowners have the right to possess arms for the purpose of defending their home. And then he listed a long array of other regulations and other issues that simply were not being decided. One of which was, do you have the right to carry arms in public places? Do you have the right to carry arms in sensitive public places? He said, such as schools or courts, suggesting that the answer could well be no. So I think there's a very serious argument that there wasn't even a Second Amendment right here. Even assuming, for the sake of argument, that there was, when two rights come in tension with each other, the courts do not automatically privilege one over the other. And in the context where people would be exercising their, let's say, assumed Second Amendment rights to bear arms in that context, it would have to be balanced against the intimidating and threatening and chilling effect that could well have on those who are trying to exercise their First Amendment rights. So absolutist as John and I are in saying government should never be able to suppress speech just because the ideas are deemed offensive or unpopular or hateful or hated. I assume you agree. I agree with the court's holdings that when in a particular context speech or expression causes what's often called a clear and present danger of actual, imminent, serious harm that cannot be prevented in any other way than suppressing speech, then speech can be suppressed. And one example of speech that satisfies that standard that the court has carved out is what it calls a true threat or intimidation. Not the way we loosely use the term threatening and oh, I feel threatened by that idea. No, not that. But when the speaker means to instill a reasonable fear that a reasonable person would feel of some kind of harm, then that's a threat that can be punished. And if I put myself in the position of somebody who wanted to express a viewpoint on the contested issues in this community, and I was facing people who were armed to the teeth, I would definitely feel threatened. I think that's a reasonable fear that other people would feel, and that therefore there would be a violation of First Amendment rights in addition to questionable non-existence of Second Amendment rights.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, just give you some practical viewpoints. I've talked to some African Americans that live in some pretty bad cities, and one lady I remember telling me she had a gun. She lived in, her neighborhood was called Beirut. It was in a big inner city. And African Americans there are armed. They say the police don't patrol them adequately, and the only defense they have is the firearm they have. In those situations, yeah, I think that's very, very reasonable. We have done a detailed paper, Right to Protest. You can go to our website and read it, where we talk about the rights to protest. I go into, is it a good idea to bring a gun to a protest march? No. Is it a good idea to bring a stick or a knife to a good protest? Not a good idea, really dumb. But you're going to have people that are going to do that. I mean, well, I was in Florida recently, and in Florida, I mean, they may be changing the rules, but when you're in like a store or something, they're carrying heat. Everybody's got guns on. They're sitting in restaurants with them. At a certain point, no one seems to be bothered by it there. I think it depends on the environment. I think in Charlottesville, someone carrying heat is going to freak everybody out. But in some places, it doesn't tend to bother people.
On the other side of that, I was going to say, you know,
Joe Bellini is a former policeman. What do you think, Joe?
I think Joe's packing heat right now.
That's like asking somebody about their underwear.
Boxers or briefs?
You know my philosophy on that. I don't think the people should be denied any arms that their government can use on them. If a cop can hang over me with some weaponry, then I have the right to the same weaponry.
When you say that as a cop,
I
that's
say that as a retired police officer, yes, sir.
well, and going on that too, though, I mean, John's talked about repeatedly, I mean, the fact, the presence of police at these protests. I mean, that's a piece that nobody talks about enough. But, you know, the whole time people are talking about wanting to, you know, I mean, weaponize or de-escalate any protesters that are there. They're not talking about the role of police.
Yeah, we talked to another people with these protests. They walk up and talk about the AR-15, these growling at them. I mean, that threatens them. And I've told them a good idea. Some policemen have actually started in St. Louis. They did it for a while, and they have all the problems. The police showed up without weapons, and it de-escalates.
Yeah.
It de-escalates.
There was a great letter that was written jointly by not only the Rutherford Institute and the ACLU, but a couple of other organizations after the July demonstrations, recalling upon both the city police and the state police to use less militarized tactics and flagging those.
Actions cause reactions.
Yeah.
A clenched fist always causes people to get nervous. A handshake makes them relax. And the police are shaking your hand. Okay, what do you think?
Well, you know my views on militarized police, why it got so completely out of hand. People knock down doors and shoot dogs and whatever just to serve search warrants. Or it's become nonsensical.
80,000 SWAT team raids occur in America.
The whole reason SWAT teams were invented is because of the drug gangs out in California with LAPD. But somehow, I went to SWAT school, and while I was sitting there thinking, I can't believe we're talking about this.
In America.
I'm SWAT certified. Thank God I've never actually had to, I managed to make it to retirement without ever having to kick anybody's door.
I mean, it's so interesting because I think we called this to talk about free speech, but all of these civil liberties and constitutional rights are so intertwined. I mean, look, we've already talked about the Second Amendment and Fourth Amendment rights.
Yeah, I get your comment about that. It's good to remember that the Constitution in general and the Bill of Rights in particular confers no rights. It merely recognizes those which are inviolable.
They're already inherent in just in nature.
In the fabric of nature.
Yeah, the Constitution does not create rights. It supposedly protects them. That's the Bill of Rights.
It's a tool to protect them.
Any other questions?
Oh, and by the way, to answer your question, boxers or briefs?
TMI!
Depends.
Is that what kids
blush anymore, but I am. We have young people.
He's a cop, so you got it.
Well, John and I are almost exactly the same age. We're probably the two oldest people here.
Anita Shelburne, Daily Progress. I wanted to go back to the issue of students not being educated in First Amendment or any of our Bill of Rights. I know that the teachers that I've talked to who are working in Virginia now worry that standards of learning is part of that problem because they have to teach to the test, and the test does not allow time to really
I've had
dig
civics teachers
into-
tell me that, yeah.
And the test doesn't test on these issues?
Not really, not in a way that digs down and helps you understand it. And then I think up to the college level, I think there is a trend towards instructing towards job, practical job hunting skills.
I had a
And not
local-
so much the humanities, and it would be in the humanities where you would dig into these.
I had a local high school civics teacher. He told me, he said, John, I can't teach civics.
Yeah,
I'm too busy preparing kids to take a test.
well, yeah.
He said, I usually use a whole semester.
I was wondering
so I
what
can't do
your
that
take
anymore.
on that was, is my perception
Yeah.
off base?
It's so
or what?
interesting. I saw, speaking of tests, the New York Times did a story in which they listed the questions, or many of the questions that you have to take to pass a citizenship test, a naturalization test, and most Americans cannot answer
Good
these
questions.
questions. And the naturalized
It's very
citizens
sad.
have to by definition.
The education system is not this time.
How do we change that?
But I think it's not just, so I really can't speak to the.
I think it's a total societal thing, don't you?
And people have to be motivated, right, to understand that, I mean, this is education that prepares you not only for meaningful, engaged citizenship, and I don't mean that in a technical sense, I mean it as a participant in our communities, and isn't that the most important function of education? But it would seem to me that that same knowledge and the skills that come with it, because it's knowledge that is very empowering, I think, should also stand you very well in any professional or occupational situation that I can think of, because I think we have to teach these principles not just as abstract, historic ideas on a piece of parchment, but this is a recipe for interaction with your peers at school, with your teachers, with your local government. And I'm so inspired as I'm looking at the high school students and teacher across from me to think of the students who have been speaking out recently, the high school students. I take great heart from that. Surely that is the best way for them to learn about their rights and about their potential power. My goodness, they have a lot of power. So, and once they raise their voices in those contexts, and I've seen students not only speaking on national TV, but op-eds have been published in the national media, they're organizing, that should be something that would clearly stand them in great stead in any job interview, right? Who wouldn't want to hire somebody who had demonstrated those abilities? So if we could, I think we can link the two. Yes, of course I want people to be generally knowledgeable, assuming that's what the tests are testing for. And of course I want them to be equipped to and eligible for performing, finding gainful, stimulating employment. But I don't think we have to choose between that. I think civics education is one aspect of that.
Well, to give you an example, last summer, one of my best students, she was intrigued by the First Amendment. She said in her law school, common law class last year, she said, the professor says, there's one area we will not be studying this year on law, the First Amendment. She said it just shocked her. And so the whole year didn't cover it. She said, so where did she get her First Amendment teaching? In our summer intern program, which she thought was so interesting. But she actually said, she says, I feel cheated. And I said, well, when I was in, it's like I was talking about my professor, when I was in law school, that was the main thing I ever taught, the First Amendment.
How many cases do we have also, though, where we get into the courtroom and the judge will actually say, I'm not going to allow you to raise any First Amendment arguments?
I've had some cases like that. Just do your argument and do all
Rickson's here with Bearing Drift. How is it possible to maintain a culture of civil discourse in an era of political tribalism?
That's a great question, and I can't tell you too much about the details, but many of you may have read or at least heard of a cover story in the Atlantic magazine a couple of years ago called The Coddling of the American Mind, co-authored by Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist at NYU, and Greg Lukianoff, the executive director of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And they talk about tribalism as one of the problems, so that this is in response to your question, Rick. What's very interesting is they combine their knowledge and expertise as First Amendment lawyer and cognitive psychologist. And John points out that in addition to violating First Amendment rights, things such as trigger warnings, safe spaces, disinvitation, no platforming, that hate speech codes, that while these are propounded with the best of intentions to protect students' mental health and emotional well-being, right? We all hear the mantra that makes me uncomfortable, it's causing emotional harm, it's causing psychic trauma, and nobody belittles those claims. But from his expertise as a psychologist, Jonathan persuasively explains that it does students more harm than good to shield them from offensive ideas that they are going to have to cope with in the rest of their lives if they are to be effective, engaged citizens rather than victims or survivors. And that got a lot of traction, and now Greg and John have expanded it into a book, which they've given me the nice opportunity to blurb, which means I've been reading a manuscript, and all I can say is that there's a lot of evidence that supports the notion that, so we're all hardwired for tribalism. It's really frightening how quickly we will divide the world into binaries, you know, and one binary that's very visible on campus now is the you're either an oppressor or you're a victim. You know, you're either privileged or you're a victim. And basically, it's a bad kind of tribalism that uses identity as a way of dividing people, dividing them so greatly that you don't even want to hear what somebody you assign to the other tribe has to say. They develop a positive view that goes back to Jesus and Martin Luther King and a lot of people that you already cited, who say, yes, we should be proud of our individual tribes and identities and whatever they are, and they're all intersectional, but we draw on them to link to our common humanity. So we're proud of what is distinctive, but we really emphasize what we share. And that book, I can't say what the contents are in detail, but just that it will give a lot of prescriptions for how we can get beyond that and how it is good not only for free speech and civil society, but for individual mental health. It's coming out in July.
Anyway, the word tribalism is kind of interesting because what studies that I cited in my book, Battlefield America, what happens when you get in mobs, groups, and whatever, and former regimes, like I say here, recognize that. What happens when you get together in so-called groups, even watching television, especially the screen devices today, is your prefrontal cortex shuts down. That's the analytical part of your brain, and people stop thinking. That's why I emphasize with students that I talk to and work with is you want to think, and how do you think? Well, thinking comes from considering other ideas, not getting in groups, not getting in mobs, not shouting down people, but it comes from individuals who stand up. And who are the great individuals in society? Who are the people we remember in society? Is it some group or whatever? No. Who is it? Well, let's see. People like Jesus, they like Gandhi, they like Martin Luther King. Why? Because they got out in front and said, shut up. We're moving forward, folks. Here's our viewpoint. You got to listen. And King was right. He looked at the Ku Klux Klan. He says, listen, you can beat me, you can kick me, you can throw me down, but I'm not going to do that to you. I'm going to love you. I'm just going to answer you. And that's the way to do it. If we taught that in the schools, you get away from that. But like I'm saying, I get more and more people who are afraid of a simple word. Words that I'm going, okay. But again, thinking is going to shut down if we don't move away from that word tribalism there. People don't think. I can say your mind will shut down. How's the mind think? By people like Martin Luther King, Nadine Strossen standing up and saying, here's what we believe, we're going to charge for it. We're going to march down the street. Non-violent, but we're also going to listen to what you have to say. We're not going to kick you in the face.
And another phenomenon is labeling. So we hear, if you say something that somebody takes offense at, they may think is racially insensitive, and then suddenly you're a racist. Well, the least effective way to try to persuade somebody to speak sensitively, especially if it's an innocent mistake, but even if it's not, the most effective counter-speech is not calling somebody a racist, much less prosecuting them, as happens in Europe and Canada and Australia and many other countries, but showing compassion. I think it goes back to religious values as well. Hate the sin, love the sinner. And there are such compelling stories of hate mongers who have been weaned away from hateful groups through a painstaking but meaningful process of dialogue.
Yeah. You can convince people if they're willing to listen, but they have to be willing to listen. And again, they have to be taught that there are different multiple viewpoints. And here's another thing. Our egos are just opinions. That's all they are. I know I have opinions. Well, my opinion may be wrong. So I'm going to listen to you and see if your opinion is right. And that way you become a real individual. And that's another thing is getting out and exercising your free speech without screaming, you become individuals again. You're not just part of a mob or a group, which we do not want to be part of.
Judge?
In almost every Supreme Court opinion on the First Amendment, you'll see, particularly if it's a state right or something, you'll see a statement about the First Amendment, but then they'll say, however, the First Amendment is not absolute. Mm-hmm. I'd be interested, and maybe follow this up in terms of the context of what occurred last August, but what do you see the limits of the free speech? What do you see what they should be, mm-hmm. and how does that differ from the current state of the law?
Well, you know, the state of the law, with some exceptions, you know, there's some Supreme Court decisions that were just wrong, but on the whole, the law is very robustly pro-free speech in opinions that are supported basically by the entire court across the whole ideological spectrum. So the law is one thing, but the culture, which somebody raised earlier, is something else entirely. So when you have these public opinion polls, they are objecting to really the First Amendment as it has been interpreted by the U.S. Supreme Court. Let me give you an illustration of what I meant, Josh, when I said the court is very robustly protecting free speech across the entire, very diverse ideological spectrum, from Ginsburg and Sotomayor on the left to Alito and Thomas on the right. The court recently decided a hate speech case. I put that in quotes, by the way, because it's not a legal term of art. The court has never carved out any category and labeled it hate speech and said it's unprotected because of its content. So it's distinct from obscenity, which is a specifically defined subset of sexual speech that is unprotected. It was a case that involved a case called Mattel versus Tom, involving Simon Tom, an Asian American rock, right? Yeah. Yes, excellent brief. Rock musician who named his band, which consisted entirely of Asian Americans, the Slants, right? And he wasn't doing it to make an ethnic slur against people like him. He was doing it to reclaim the term, to defang its stigmatizing power, and as a statement of pride and empowerment.
Plus, it's a good that you remember it. Like the Beatles.
Let's not forget. And there was, in essence, a hate speech law buried in the U.S. patent statutes that said that the patent office and trademark office could deny trademark protection to any term that was disparaging or demeaning on the basis of race, ethnicity, and so forth. The Supreme Court unanimously struck that down, unanimously, every single one of them. So, you know, what I learned in writing this book is you can take all of the complicated case law and really boil it down to two core principles. One is a reason why government may never censor speech for this reason. That's called the viewpoint neutrality principle. And the other is the only justification for censoring speech, and that is the emergency principle. So the viewpoint neutrality principle has been called the bedrock of our free speech jurisprudence, that government may never suppress or punish speech because of dislike of its viewpoint, its message, its content, its ideas, no matter how deeply loathed by no matter how many people. That is never a justification. That principle was put forward very strongly, for example, in the flag burning cases, because that's a deeply loathed viewpoint to this day. I think it probably still is the single most unpopular message by public opinion polls. Correspondingly, the emergency principle, which I alluded to earlier, is that you may punish or suppress speech if, but only if, that suppression is necessary to prevent specific, imminent, serious harm that the speech will directly cause. And government has to exhaust every other method for averting the harm, such as police protection or counter speech, debate and dialogue, and may only censor speech as a last resort. And then the Supreme Court has created several subcategories of speech that do satisfy the emergency principle. I mentioned one, which is a true threat. Another one would be intentional incitement of imminent violence, where the violence is likely to happen imminently. And over time, the court has, starting in the 60s, no coincidence, in the context of the civil rights movement, the court has gradually strengthened those principles and been very demanding before it will find that the emergency principle is satisfied. And this is an important point because, you know, I argue that we can't have equality without free speech. The civil rights movement could not have occurred successfully without these very, very speech protective rulings that were mostly issued in cases where civil rights demonstrators were sought to be silenced because their words were seen as certainly threatening, certainly dangerous, certainly offensive, definitely hated, and in some cases the communities even considered their words to be hateful and hate speech.
Yeah, we're trying to shut them down. Martin Luther King, yeah.
So I basically am very supportive of the law. Now, the culture and persuading people that the law is right is something else.
Can I follow up and bring it
No,
to
may
a local context? And there was a challenge to Mr. Kessler's the planned riot of last August. The city had made the decision not to cancel his protest, but to move it to a different location, to which the city said we better enable it to prevent the kinds of acts that occurred. And that lost. And part of the reason that lost, in terms of Judge Conrad's decision, was he emphasized that the predictions about potential violence were purely speculative. He didn't really have any real solid basis for that.
So the one that he didn't present, the evidence wasn't there.
The what?
The evidence wasn't there.
That,
You got to present the facts.
right. He's saying that it was just speculation. There was no certain evidence. Well, Mr. Kessler's applied for a permit again. It's already been denied almost a year ahead of time, which presents some other problems. But at least as far, do you think it will change the analysis, given the events of last year, in terms of this idea of potential violence.
If you read the Heafy report, Josh, the police didn't do their job. That was literally clear. They didn't put up barriers, they didn't do any of that. They actually stood down some of them. I talked to a number of police before the event. In St. Louis, a number of areas, Democratic Convention, the police took bicycles and barriers and separated the people. They didn't do that here. My opinion is if the police would have done their job, you wouldn't have had any of that. They just didn't do it. Okay, and that was really clear. It's a long report. Have you had a chance to read it yet?
Yeah, I've read it. And I'll push back on you a little bit on this too, but if that's all right.
What are you pushing back about?
Well, because in at least preliminarily,
Yeah.
One of the arguments that they were making is that in this particular space, we don't have the ability to undertake the kind of efforts that you're talking about.
Yeah, a lot of the police weren't arguing with that, though. I talked to them. They met with me beforehand, and I was there when they met. The fear they had was not the guy, what are they, alt-right guys,
Yeah.
so-called Nazis. It was the Antifa they were scared to death about. And I told them, put the barriers up. I even suggested that the chief beforehand give a speech. Alan had talked about Martin Luther King and nonviolence. He just blew it all off.
But this is, so and I'm not an expert on the facts, although I did read the commission report, and on its face, it seemed very persuasive that the fault was in inadequate training and supervision and communication, and that trying to subdivide it at the last minute was detrimental to security. But I also read the opinion, and there was evidence that could have persuaded a judge that, and I don't know all the evidence, so I'm just putting this out there, not reaching my own conclusion. There was evidence that could have persuaded the judge that the fear of violence was a pretext for suppressing a message based on dislike or its viewpoint, because there was some evidence in the record that we just don't want to hear those ideas. Now, since we have high school students here, I want to give...
Well, one thing the judge came to the conclusion, it was content-based, and there was...
Yes, exactly.
And Doug was there. What do you think, Doug?
Yeah, I mean, that's what it... He said part of it was based on the fact that
they just didn't like
they didn't move the...
that was the First Amendment issue.
The counter-protest rallies, and from that, and some of the statements of city councilors.
And we lost the police chief now for an obvious reason.
He found there was an indication of content.
And now with so much more advanced warning and opportunity for preparation, again, you can only use even the threat of violence as a justification for censorship, only as a last resort, only if you can't rely on law enforcement. And what more important responsibility does law enforcement have than protecting constitutional rights
setting up the barriers and doing it right? They didn't do it.
But I want to give you an example from the Supreme Court, because the abstract test is one thing, but let me give you a concrete example of how the Supreme Court enforced it. And it comes from the landmark case in which the ACLU represented Mary Beth Tinker, Tinker versus Des Moines School District, in which the court said, as you probably all know, the Constitution does not stop at the schoolhouse gates. And it protected teachers' rights too. I always want to point that out. So I happened to be a kid in Minnesota at the time, and this is Iowa, so I'm personally familiar with the context. The war in Vietnam was very popular then. The anti-war protests had not yet really seriously started. Mary Beth Tinker's school, the Des Moines School District, had a lot of people, classmates had fathers, brothers, uncles, etc., who were actually fighting in Vietnam, some who had been killed in Vietnam. So it was not mere idle speculation for the school authorities to fear that protesting the war could lead to a material and substantial disturbance, that people were very upset. That was very offensive, very controversial speech at a personal level as well as at a political level. So when, in that context, the court still says a mere undifferentiated fear or apprehension of violence is not enough, they really put teeth into that test, and I think we have to equally take it seriously.
Landmark case. Anyway, the food's ready?
Not yet. I have to say, for the sake of the students also, they may be interested, I think everybody else is probably aware, but the differing of opinion that you're seeing right here So Josh Wheeler and James were actually on this particular issue, so they're also First Amendment attorneys, like Nadine and John, but this was one area where we actually kind of butted heads this past year, because Josh and James actually defended the other side in the arguments. So whereas, you know, Rutherford and ACLU were coming in and arguing on behalf of the First Amendment rights and saying, you know, it was important to be able to have this, Josh and James were arguing on the other side, defending the city's arguments.
But I think it's fair to say that we agreed on the principles,
Exactly.
and that
Correct.
reasonable people can apply the principles differently.
That's
not an
exactly.
easy thing to do.
There's nothing you said today that I would disagree with in terms of.
And I say I'm a little bit agnostic and ignorant on the facts.
And well, and I can speak for John and I, 99% of the time are on the same time. This was purely a question of the application of the particular facts to this case, and that we think that the judge misunderstood the facts, but that's
But that's also
But
kind
we
of
lost,
interesting
so.
exercise in how you'll see. I mean, it's not always just easy to be black and white and have everyone, even when they're coming from the same perspective for the most part.
But I hope that the lesson that comes out of this is that, sort of coming back to an earlier question, is that you can disagree and be civil about it.
Exactly.
You know,
That's what we're talking about, yeah.
So even when John's wrong, you know, be civil about it.
Well,
Do we have any questions
as
from the
many people
governor?
have said to me, you're wrong. Anyway, we got some free food here and drinks. So
I mean, yeah, everybody can grab them too, but I mean, you might want to.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, see, I'm a law professor, and I see
Okay.
students, and so I have to ask questions of the students.
I'm picking my own brain right now to see where to.
taking you now.
What about these public opinion polls that have been taken of university students? Do you think they're true of high school students as well, when most of the students you know support censoring offensive speech or banning offensive speech?
So-called hate speech.
Yeah.
I would say that it's definitely there. I've seen some people that I'm like even close friends with kind of shy away because people have like really strong opinions at this point now, like with what you said, like the just tribalness of politics. People have these opinions and they want to shy away from like other opinions that would kind of go against their own or make points against their own just on principle or whatever. But I think a lot of people too are really eager to have conversations across political borders or just on different beliefs. Like there was, after the stuff that happened last month with the shooting in Florida, there was an account started on Instagram that was just, they would post a picture that was like a political topic and then just have kids in the comments just talk about it. And it was, from what I saw, very respectful. Kids would just put their viewpoints out, and I thought it was really interesting.
Great.
Yeah, I think for the most part, people engage personally at our school engage in civil conversation. But what I notice personally with me is I watch like arguments slowly shift from like a factual argument and standpoint based on historical and modern evidence to more of an emotional perspective. And I mean, of course you use your own emotions to formulate your opinions, but to debate your opinions, I think you need well-rounded facts, and I feel like people aren't as, and this might be coming back to like the whole problems with the education system, but I feel people are slowly, they're willing to engage in civil conversation, however, they may not be as well versed as they are, rather speaking from a purely emotional standpoint rather than an actual factual standpoint.
One of the developments in universities, and it's been traced to some academic trends, not even trends, they've been around for a long time now, like postmodernism and structuralism, that feelings are not debatable. And so if somebody says, well, I feel this way, that's a debate stopper, right? There's no way you can respond to it. And unfortunately, that has been allowed to stop debates on college campuses, including in courses. It takes a lot of courage. Thank you for saying I have it. Unfortunately, it hasn't yet come to the test.
Brandeis said that great opinion.
Well, yeah, but
the founding fathers were not cowards.
That was
They stood up.
exactly, you know, but I understand why some people, especially those who don't have tenure, don't want to stick their neck out. So if you're accused by a student as a professor, and this happens more and more frequently, so there's a recent example from Princeton, right? The professor is using the actual N-word to make a pedagogical point. I thought it was a completely legitimate, factual point, and the student says, I feel that's racist. That's the end of it. The professor ended up not teaching the course. I think he wanted to go through with it, but he was just subject to so much harassment and bullying, and who wants to put yourself through that grief? And sadly, then, polls show that a lot of other professors and the university administration actually supports the professor's right, but silently. They dare not speak out because then they become attacked for being racist, right? Because suddenly you're on the bad team, you're in the wrong tribe, right? And we somehow have to change that. One of the polls that I saw recently that was done by the Cato Institute, or commissioned by the Cato Institute, and it relates to that incident at William and Mary last fall. My ACLU colleague, as you probably all know, was not allowed to talk to the students who had invited her, ironically, to talk about students' protest rights. And if you've seen the video, it's out there. It is really shocking. And they basically said, if you defend free speech for white supremacists, that is completely indistinguishable from being a white supremacist.
They shot her down.
And the Cato survey shows that a majority of the entire public agreed with that proposition, that it is at defending free speech for Nazis or other racist ideas is as bad as, that was the exact wording, is as bad as having those ideas yourself. Even more sadly, 65% of African Americans took that position. So it's nobody, especially those of us who have been fighting against racism all of our lives, it's very, very painful to be subjected to that kind of attack, and I understand why a lot of people don't want to put themselves out there in jeopardy of facing. Yeah. So so students, I want to ask you this. The other thing that the surveys show is that college students say that they're constantly engaging in self-censorship. They say they are walking on eggshells, and professors too, because the power is in the mob on the social media. And so they're so afraid of saying something that somebody might say is racist or sexist or some other ist, and that they're not expressing their viewpoints even in class. Now I feel that's kind of a loaded question. How can you even answer that question?
So could you repeat the question?
Are you self-censoring yourself?
Do you feel comfortable saying things that you know a majority of your classmates might disagree with or find offensive?
Personally, no, because I coming out of the August 12th incident. Personally, I'm a huge, I'm a kind of an adamant fan of the First Amendment, and I said that racism in America has no place in America. However, these people still have a right to protest, and it was kind of a bombardment of primarily peers and classmates, just saying, well, are you a white supremacist? Are you a Nazi? And I mean, I personally no, but I feel that, it's just, I don't know, I think that people self-censor themselves all the time because in modern societal norms, it's more important to be liked than it is to make a difference, for lack of a better, way to say it.
I think it's it is definitely scary to kind of put your viewpoint out when it's protecting the rights of someone that you may not agree with. But I think there are a lot of, one of the arguments that I kind of found interesting at our school was with the walkouts that happened for the thing that happened in Florida again. I was looking at a lot around the Tinker versus Des Moines case for journalism because I wrote an article about student rights to protest and stuff like that. And it comes up in our school a lot with whether or not kids should be able to wear a Confederate flag on their clothing or whatever. And so when I was writing that article, in this case it comes off as though you're protecting the rights of the kids to walk out of school, but then it's easy to also apply that, and rightfully so, to the other side where kids can express these other views that, regardless of what they might represent to them, whether they're offensive or not, it applies to everyone. And so I feel like it depends on what context that article was written in. Like if I wrote that article in the context of a student got in trouble for wearing a Confederate flag, it would be received with a lot more negativity, I feel like.
Yeah, so regarding our school district, it's primarily it's a majority white school. Like a lot of suburban, a lot of suburb areas feed into our school, and we take the half of the outskirts of Albemarle County. So a lot, and sometimes I'll see in the halls people making sly comments to people that wear Confederate flags, and despite how you feel about its historical context and whatnot, it doesn't open up a discussion about its meaningfulness. Rather, it alienates the people that feel it's just a part of their identity to wear symbols such as a Confederate flag.
Well, one thing I'm seeing, and I'll say this, I've always argued the First Amendment's a steam valve. It lets people who are different blow their steam off.
Right.
What we're facing in this society, if we're not really careful, is if you don't let people do it, don't let them get out there and speak, blow their steam off, a lot of them get very angry.
Yeah.
They start wanting to get violent. They go underground, some of them. And we may be seeing some of that happening today. So I think what you're seeing is, let's keep the steam valve operating. Let people speak, whatever. You can disagree with them. Their symbol may be repulsive, whatever it may be. But like I say, if the steam valve is not operating, and I think that the First Amendment is tolerance with a capital T. That's why it works. That's why you can have a democracy.
Right.
You have people disagreeing, whatever. And I see what you're facing. I have a number of students in my summer intern program that say the same thing. They're afraid to say the wrong word. They get banged on the head. And what happens is, let's say the guy with the Confederate flag starts feeling that he's hated and denigrated and whatever. He gets online and sees the wrong kind of stuff, and he says, maybe I should get a gun. We don't want that.
Absolutely.
So how do you stop that? Let people talk. And the schools should be promoting that. And
Yeah.
I've talked to some high school teachers. I said, open a forum. Have them come in and debate these things. Don't shut down the Confederate. Have them come in and debate the Confederate flag. That kind of thing. But a lot of schools don't want to do that. They don't listen.
That's one thing that I've really liked about what our school's been doing lately.
Yeah.
Our principal has, after the Parkland shooting, he basically allowed an open discussion for everyone opposing viewpoints to express their thoughts and opinions.
Don't make people bottle it up.
Right, because otherwise people are going to find, once they have balled up feelings, they're going to find people that feel similar, and then it's just one giant group of suppressed emotions, and then
And the other thing I've seen, I've handled some really, I'd say 80% of the clients at some period of my life, I wouldn't want to eat dinner with them because I get an upset stomach. I don't agree with them. But here's the thing, the Jason Kessers and people like that, they love the publicity. Charlottesville put up a big sign that said, go for it. They did an amazing amount of recruitment. I mean, they really did. They used that as the perfect recruitment tool. And that's another thing that cities and stuff have to be careful of. Don't set yourself up so these guys can recruit 3 times their number. And they do that very effectively.
Yeah.
They want to be in the news. Once they're in the news, it's what the great Katharine Hepburn actress said. It doesn't matter what they say about you as long as they spell your name correctly. And these guys, they're sitting in front of me, and I know all of a sudden, oh, these are some local guys you know. All they want to do is get in the news because they get their pals around, they get their guns, and they stand in front of the Robert E. Lee statue and get their picture in the paper.
I'm going to interrupt for one moment. You guys can continue to talk. We've got the room till 5:30, but there are also some refreshments, so feel free if you want to grab some nibbles.
You young guys, I don't think you can do the wine, but I think